Josephine Calloway did not drop the tray when Cordelia Prescott called her the ranch's fattest asset in front of 40 guests. She set it down, carefully, cup by cup, saucer by saucer, until the silence in the room was louder than the insult had been. Then she untied her apron, folded it in half, and laid it over the back of a chair like she was finished for the night, though the night, and everything in it, had barely begun. If you've ever stood in a room and felt the whole world decide who you were before you'd said a single word, this story is for you. Hit subscribe before we start, because you will not want to miss where this one goes. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. And stay until the end, because the last 5 minutes of this video are the reason 4 million people couldn't stop talking about it. Now, let's go back to where it all began, Larkspur Hollow, Montana Territory, the spring of 1886. Larkspur Hollow was not a large town, but it liked to think of itself as one. It had a bank, a dry goods store, a church with a bell that rang 10 minutes early out of habit rather than accuracy, a livery, a schoolhouse with 1 teacher and 31 children of assorted ages, and a cattle operation on its northern edge that fed half the county, the Cartwright Ranch, 7,000 acres of grass and water rights that had made Jonah Cartwright, at 31, the wealthiest unmarried man in 3 counties, and the subject of every mother's dinner table calculations. Josephine Calloway had been the ranch's cook for 4 years. She rose before the hands did, at 4 in the morning, when the bunkhouse was still dark and the only sound in the yard was her own boots on frozen dirt. By the time the first rider came stamping into the kitchen for coffee, she had already split kindling, hauled 2 buckets of water from the well, banked the stove, and turned a slab of side pork and a sack of cornmeal into something that would keep 20 men working until noon. She moved through her kitchen the way some women moved through a ballroom, sure of every step, never once looking down to check her footing, never once asking anyone to make room for her, because she had already made it herself. She was a big woman, heavy-set in the way of someone who had spent 15 years lifting cast iron and hauling feed sacks, arms strong enough to swing a full stockpot one-handed, shoulders broad from years of work no one else wanted to do before sunrise. Her hands were rough at the knuckles and sure at the wrist, the hands of a woman who had never once had the luxury of being delicate about anything. It was not a body built for admiration. It was a body built for labor, and it had never once let her down. The town had opinions about her anyway. 4 years cooking for that ranch, Mrs. Ada Pruitt said to her sister outside the dry goods store, not troubling to lower her voice as Josephine passed with a basket of flour. And not one man's come calling. Can't say I'm surprised. A woman built like a grain wagon isn't exactly what a man pictures at his supper table. Not across from him, anyhow. Behind the stove is one thing. Her sister laughed, a thin, satisfied sound, and added, well, someone has to keep those ranch hands fed. Suppose it's a mercy she found something she's suited for. Josephine did not turn around. She adjusted the basket on her hip, nodded once to the shopkeeper's boy holding the door, and kept walking, her jaw tight, her spine straighter than it had been a moment before. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that crying only gave people something else to talk about, and she was not in the business of handing out material. She had come to Larkspur Hollow 5 years earlier, after her father's small farm failed and her mother passed the same hard winter. Pneumonia, the doctor had said, though Josephine had always privately believed it was grief that finished the job the cold had started. She had no family left to speak of, no dowry, no property beyond 1 stubborn acre with her mother's grave on it, and no letters of introduction to anyone of consequence. Only a set of hands that knew how to turn very little into enough, and a stubborn refusal to apologize for taking up room in the world. Jonah Cartwright had inherited the ranch from his father 2 years back, and inherited, along with it, a reputation for being the kind of rich man who didn't act rich. He wore the same worn canvas coat as his ranch hands, patched at one elbow because he saw no sense in replacing a coat that still kept the rain off. He mucked stalls when a man was short-handed, rode fence in weather that sent lesser men indoors, and settled disputes among his crew with a few flat sentences rather than a raised voice. He was quiet, not sullen, just economical, the way some men are economical with money. He spent his words the way his father had spent nothing, carefully, and only where they'd do some good. The first time he noticed Josephine, really noticed her, not simply as the woman who kept his crew fed, was on an ordinary Tuesday in March, when he came in from a fence line in the rain to find the whole kitchen crew standing idle because the flour delivery hadn't come and no one knew what to feed 30 hungry men with 3 hours' notice. Josephine had already solved it. She was working a batch of cornbread from what she had on hand. A little bacon grease, the last of the cornmeal, and a jar of preserved corn she'd put up herself in August, against exactly this kind of trouble. Sleeves shoved to her elbows, giving orders to 2 ranch hands like she'd been born giving them. "You're running the whole outfit out of a half-empty pantry," Jonah said from the doorway, not as a question. "Somebody has to," Josephine said, not looking up from the mixing bowl. "Might as well be someone who knows where things are and isn't waiting on a wagon that isn't coming." He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face settled, the way a man's face settles when he's just found the one thing on a long list that doesn't need fixing. He watched her for a moment longer than the situation strictly required. The economy of her movements, the way she never once looked flustered, despite 30 men's dinner riding on a jar of corn, and her own good sense. He didn't say anything else that day. He just took his coffee, said thank you, and went back out into the rain. And if anyone had asked him what he was thinking as he rode the fence line the rest of that afternoon, he would not have had an easy answer for them. It became a habit before either of them called it one. Every morning, before the first bell, Jonah Cartwright came into the ranch kitchen alone, sat at the same end of the long table, and drank his coffee in silence while Josephine worked. He never asked to be waited on. He never treated her like part of the furniture either, the way most ranch owners treated their cooks. A fixture to be fed by and not spoken to, someone whose name they might not even trouble to learn correctly. He looked at her when he spoke to her. He called her Josephine, never cook, never girl, and he asked her questions that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with genuine curiosity. "Where'd you learn to work a sourdough starter that don't quit on you?" he asked one Thursday, watching her fold a batch of dough with the ease of long practice, her hands moving in a rhythm that looked almost like music if a person watched it long enough. "My grandmother," Josephine said, "kept the same starter alive through 2 moves and a flood, said a starter's like anything else worth keeping. You don't let it go just because it's inconvenient to carry." Jonah considered that for a moment, the way he considered most things, slowly and all the way through, turning it over like a man checking a fence post for rot before he leaned on it. "That's so," he said. It wasn't a question. It was agreement. By April, it was a fixed point in both their days. He came in at 4:30, before the other hands stirred, and for 20 minutes the kitchen belonged to the 2 of them, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the quiet clatter of Josephine's hands moving through work that never stopped, and Jonah's low, unhurried voice asking about things that had nothing to do with land or cattle. How she got a crust to hold its shape in a cast-iron oven with an uneven fire, how she'd learned to read weather by the way smoke bent off the chimney, why she salted a stew at the start instead of the end, the way most cooks did. Salt at the start, it works its way all through the meat while it's still tough enough to need it, she told him. Salt at the end just sits on top, tastes fine the first bite, falls off by the third. "Ranching's the same," Jonah said. "Man who only shows up for the branding and the selling never learns the herd." Herd knows it too, won't settle for him the way it settles for a hand who's been there since calving. Josephine glanced up at that, surprised he'd made the comparison at all, and found him watching her with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough to count. He never once mentioned her size, he never made a joke to put her at ease about it, and he never made the kind of pointed compliment men sometimes made to prove they weren't bothered by it. No clumsy assurances, no, "I don't mind that you're built the way you are." He simply never treated it as something that needed addressing at all, which was, in its own quiet way, more than anyone else in Larkspur Hollow had managed in 5 years. "You've got a strange way of running a ranch," Josephine told him once, sliding a plate in front of him without being asked. "Man of your standing eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of having it brought up to the main house like your father did." "Kitchen's where the useful conversation happens," Jonah said. "Rest of the house just echoes. My father ate alone at the head of a long table for 30 years and called it dignity. Looked like loneliness to me, dressed up in good linen." She laughed, a short, surprised sound, like it had gotten away from her before she meant to let it. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh in 4 years of employment, and something in his chest noted it the way a man notes the first thaw of spring, quietly, and with the sense that something important had just begun, something he wasn't yet prepared to put a name to. The ritual held through the weeks that followed. Rain or shine, he came at 4:30, and by early May the ranch hands had noticed, in the way that ranch hands notice everything eventually, and said nothing about it. Partly out of respect for Jonah, and partly because every man on that crew had eaten Josephine's cooking long enough to understand exactly why a smart man might find reasons to linger near that kitchen. "You're up before the roosters again," old Tom Findlay, the ranch's longest-serving hand, remarked to Jonah one morning, not quite hiding his grin as he passed the kitchen door. "Coffee's better fresh," Jonah said, which was true, and also not the whole of it, and Tom Findlay knew both facts equally well and kept his grin to himself out of professional courtesy. Eleanor Prescott had buried one husband, married his fortune to a second, and now intended to marry her daughter to the only bachelor in the county worth the trouble. Cordelia Prescott was pretty in the practiced catalog way of a woman raised to be looked at, with a wardrobe ordered specially from Denver and an education in nothing more useful than the correct way to pour tea, and Eleanor had spent the better part of 2 years steering her daughter toward every social occasion Jonah Cartwright might attend. She arrived at the ranch kitchen on a pretense, a basket of preserves for the hands, though everyone present understood the preserves were an excuse to walk the property and be seen doing something thoughtful in front of Jonah, who happened, as Eleanor had made certain to learn beforehand, to be expected home from the north pasture within the hour. She found Josephine at the stove and looked her over the way a buyer looks over livestock at auction, quick, assessing, and entirely without malice on the surface, which was, Josephine had come to understand, precisely how Eleanor Prescott's cruelty preferred to travel. "Bless her heart," Eleanor said to no one in particular, though loudly enough to be heard by everyone in the room, including Cordelia, who had trailed in behind her mother with a parasol she had no earthly use for indoors. Still no husband at 9 and 20. Some women simply aren't suited to it. Better off, I always say, finding their purpose somewhere useful. The kitchen does seem to suit you so well, dear. A woman ought to know where she's needed. Josephine did not set down her spoon. She did not flush, or stammer, or look away. She finished stirring the pot, tasted it once from the side of the spoon, added a pinch more salt, and only then wiped her hands on her apron and said, evenly, "It does suit me. Thank you for noticing, Mrs. Prescott." Eleanor's smile thinned by a fraction. She had expected embarrassment, not calm agreement. But she recovered quickly, turning her attention toward the door as Jonah's boots sounded on the porch steps. Timed, Josephine suspected, with more precision than coincidence usually allowed. "Mr. Cartwright." Cordelia was only just saying how she hoped you'd come to the Founders' Dance next month. I go to the Founders' Dance most years, Jonah said, mild as ever, hanging his hat by the door. Didn't know it needed hoping over. Cordelia offered a practiced laugh at that, though nothing about the exchange had been particularly funny, and added, I only meant it's such a rare pleasure to see you there, Mr. Cartwright. You're so seldom out among proper company. Depends what a man counts as proper company, Jonah said, and let his gaze move, briefly and without ceremony, toward the stove, where Josephine had gone back to her pot as though the conversation had nothing to do with her. He said nothing else on the matter. He didn't defend Josephine out loud, didn't make a scene of it, but Josephine noticed that his jaw had gone tight in the particular way it did before he said something a man would regret provoking, and that he'd crossed the room and stood a half-step closer to the stove than he had before Eleanor Prescott walked in, as if some part of him had simply decided, without discussion, where he intended to be standing. Eleanor took her leave shortly after, preserves duly delivered, Cordelia's parasol duly displayed, satisfied enough with the visit's small progress that she did not press the matter further that day. After they left, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. She means well, Josephine said finally, mostly to break the silence, in her way. No, Jonah said, she doesn't. But you handled it better than most men I've faced down cattle rustlers with, and with considerably less shouting. He picked up his hat. I'll be back for coffee tomorrow. You always are, Josephine said. Some things are worth keeping regular, Jonah said, and left before she could decide whether that was meant as a comment about the coffee or something larger, which was, Josephine thought, exactly like him, saying the truest thing in the room, and then walking out before anyone had a chance to make it into something bigger than it was. The trouble came from a direction Josephine hadn't guarded against. Her late father had left one debt unsettled, a small loan against the old farm, taken out the winter before he died, to cover seed and a new roof, held by the Larkspur Hollow Bank. Josephine had been paying it down for years, a little each month from her wages, careful never to miss an installment even in the leanest seasons, and it had never once threatened her peace until Horace Bellwether, the bank's manager and Eleanor Prescott's second cousin by marriage, called her into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. The notes being called in full, Bellwether said, not quite meeting her eyes, shuffling a stack of papers that didn't need shuffling. Bank's tightening its lending this season. Nothing personal, Miss Calloway. I've paid every installment on time for 3 years, Josephine said, standing straight-backed in front of his desk, hands folded in front of her the way she'd folded them since girlhood when she meant to hold her temper. You know that better than anyone in this building. I do. The Bellwether still wouldn't look at her, but the decisions come from higher than me. It hadn't. Josephine understood that the moment she saw the look on his face, the particular discomfort of a man carrying out an errand he was ashamed of but too indebted, in one fashion or another, to refuse. She understood, too, exactly who had likely requested the favor, and exactly why. A woman removed from Larkspur Hollow by financial ruin was a woman no longer taking up space at the Cartwright breakfast table, and no longer standing in the way of a match Eleanor Prescott had spent 2 years arranging. The full amount was more than Josephine had, and more than she could raise inside the 30 days Bellwether gave her. If she couldn't pay, the bank would take what little her father had left her, the last acre of land with her mother's grave on it, and she would very likely lose face at the ranch besides, unable to hold her head up in a town that would treat her ruin as confirmation of everything Eleanor Prescott had implied about her all along. She told no one at first. She worked her morning shift as though nothing had happened, split kindling with more force than the task required, and said little, her replies to the hands' morning chatter shorter than usual, her hands finding small, unnecessary tasks to keep them occupied. Jonah noticed anyway. He always did. "Something's sitting wrong with you," he said over coffee, 3 days into her silence, watching her fold the same dish towel a second time, though it was already square. "You've refolded that towel 4 times since I sat down." Josephine set the towel down. "It's not ranch business." "Didn't ask if it was ranch business. Asked because you look like you're carrying something too heavy to set down alone, and I've never known you to carry anything without a reason." She told him, finally, flatly, without asking for anything, because asking had never come naturally to her, and she wasn't about to start now, over money, in front of the one man in town who'd never once looked at her like she needed rescuing. She laid out the numbers plainly, the way she'd have laid out a recipe: the debt, the 30 days, the acre with her mother's grave, Bellwether's unwillingness to meet her eyes. Jonah listened without interrupting, his coffee going cold and untouched in front of him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly on the table, the way he turned over any problem before deciding how to solve it. "That's not tight lending," he said finally. "Banks never called in a current note early in the whole time I've done business with them. That's Bellwether doing somebody's bidding. Man doesn't have the spine to call in a paid note on his own account, and everybody in this county knows it." "I know what it likely is," Josephine said. "Doesn't change what I owe, or when it's owed by." "No," Jonah agreed, "but it changes who I need to have a conversation with, and how soon." He stood, hat already in hand, though the sun wasn't yet fully up. "I've got business in town this morning." "Jonah," she said, his given name for the first time since she'd known him, and it stopped him at the door. "I didn't tell you this so you'd fix it for me." "I know that," he said. "You told me because you were carrying something too heavy, and I asked. What I do with it now is my business, same as the note's yours." He put his hat on. "I'll be back for coffee tomorrow, same as always." He left, and Josephine stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, turning over the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having said a hard thing out loud to someone and not immediately regretting it. The Founders' Dance fell 9 days later, and the whole of Larkspur Hollow turned out for it. Every rancher, every shopkeeper, every mother with a marriageable daughter, packed into the Grange Hall under lanterns strung from the rafters, the floor swept and waxed for the occasion, a fiddle and a borrowed piano tuning up in the corner. Josephine had not planned to attend at all, but the ranch's kitchen crew was catering the supper, and there was no one else who could manage 30 dishes for 100 guests on schedule. She was setting the last of the serving trays, sleeves rolled, apron dusted with flour, when Eleanor Prescott found her, Cordelia trailing a step behind, dressed in blue silk that had clearly cost more than Josephine earned in half a year. "Still working even tonight," Eleanor said, pitched to carry across the room, her voice honeyed and precise. "I do admire your dedication, Miss Calloway, though I confess I wonder what it must be, watching a room like this from the kitchen door rather than the floor. Bless her heart, some women simply aren't suited to it. Still no husband at 9 and 20. I do hope you've made peace with it, as I truly believe you have." The room had gone quiet, in the way rooms do when they sense a performance beginning. Cordelia smiled behind her fan. Someone near the punch bowl laughed, a short, ugly sound, quickly swallowed when no one else joined in. Josephine set down the tray. She untied her apron, folded it once, and laid it over the back of a chair. The same motion, unhurried, that would open this very story if anyone were ever to tell it from the beginning. Then she turned, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned long ago that a raised voice was easy to dismiss as temper. She spoke instead the way she cooked, plainly and with total command of what she was doing. "I have made peace with quite a lot, Mrs. Prescott. I made peace with losing my mother the same winter I lost my father's farm. I made peace with coming to this town with nothing but a good set of hands and a stubborn back, and building something out of nothing because nobody was going to build it for me. I have fed 30 hungry men before sunrise for 4 years running without once being late, without once being short a meal, and without once asking this town for its pity. So no, I have not made peace with being unmarried at 29, because it was never a debt I owed anyone an apology for. I have simply never needed a husband to know what I'm worth. That's the peace you seem unable to make peace with, and I expect it's the reason you've spent 2 years walking your daughter past a man who's never once looked her way with anything more than politeness. The hall was utterly silent now. Cordelia's fan had stopped moving mid-air. Eleanor recovered first, her smile brittle, a flush rising at her throat that no amount of composure could quite hide. How very spirited. Though I wonder if spirit pays a banknote. I hear the Calloway land is set to be seized within the week. Perhaps that's the sort of pride a woman in your position can't quite afford to indulge. That note, a voice said from the doorway, was called in on a favor to you, Eleanor, and it's settled as of this afternoon. Every head turned. Jonah Cartwright stood in the doorway in his good coat, hat in hand, having clearly heard enough of the conversation from the porch to know exactly where to step into it. I had a talk with Bellwether, he went on, walking into the room now, unhurried as always, the crowd parting for him without needing to be asked. And with the banks board out of Bozeman, who weren't aware one of their managers had been calling in good current notes as personal favors for family. Miss Calloway's debt is paid in full, out of my own account, and the deed to her land is filed clear in her name at the county office as of this morning. She owes that bank nothing, and she owes you considerably less than that. He looked at Eleanor, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse for her than if he'd shouted, "You'll want to have a word with your cousin about what he's willing to risk his position over. I understand the bank's board has some questions of their own for him already." Eleanor had no answer for that. She opened her mouth once, found nothing in it worth saying in front of 100 witnesses, and took Cordelia's arm instead, steering her toward the door with as much dignity as the moment allowed, the first time in Larkspur Hollow's memory that Eleanor Prescott had exited a room without having the last word in it. Jonah crossed the room to where Josephine stood, the whole hall watching now, no pretense left of anyone minding their own conversation, the fiddle player himself having stopped mid-tune to watch. "You didn't have to settle that note in front of everybody," Josephine said quietly, her voice steadier than her hands, which had found the edge of the table to hold on to. Wasn't going to let her walk out thinking she'd won anything. He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since Josephine had known him, Jonah Cartwright looked less than entirely composed, like a man who'd rehearsed something on the ride into town and found the rehearsal wasn't enough now that the moment had actually arrived. "I've been coming to that kitchen every morning for 4 months, he said, loud enough now for the room to hear, though his eyes never left hers, and it was never about the coffee, and I expect half this town's known that a good deal longer than I've let myself admit it. I've sat across from a lot of people in my life who wanted something from me, my land, my name, my money, my father's cattle before that. You've never once asked me for a single thing. Not when your father's note came due, not tonight, not in 4 years of feeding 30 men without a word of complaint. I've never met anybody as capable, or as honest, or as hard to rattle as you, Josephine Calloway. That's not a small thing to me. That's the whole thing." He paused, and the room seemed to hold its breath with him, 100 guests forgetting entirely that they'd come for a dance. "I'm not asking you to marry me because your land's clear now, or because Eleanor Prescott had it coming tonight," he went on. "I'm asking because you're the finest, steadiest person I know, capable of running a ranch's whole kitchen out of a half-empty pantry and 100-guest supper without breaking stride, and I'd like the chance to sit across from you at breakfast for the rest of my life instead of just 20 minutes of it, 6 days a week." Josephine looked at him for a long moment, and, for the first time in the whole of this story, her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for her eyes to shine before she blinked it back, her hand tightening once on the edge of the table. "I've never been anybody's finest anything," she said. "You are now," Jonah said. "Whole town just watched it happen, and I expect they'll be talking about it long after we've both forgotten the particulars." She said yes, not with tears, not with a speech, just a small, steady nod, and then, because it was exactly like her, she added, "You'll still have to drink your coffee at 4:30. I'm not changing the schedule for a husband, married or not." "Wouldn't dream of asking you to," Jonah said, and for the second time in this story, Josephine Calloway laughed. Bright, unguarded, the whole Grange Hall hearing it this time, instead of just one man in an empty kitchen, and a few of the ranch hands near the punch bowl started clapping before anyone quite decided it was the proper moment to. They married 3 weeks later, in a ceremony small enough to fit in the ranch's front yard. No silk, no imported flowers, just the ranch hands, the minister, old Tom Findlay standing witness with his hat pressed to his chest, and a wedding supper Josephine insisted on cooking herself, because I'll be damned if I let anyone else feed this crowd on my own wedding day, best day or not. Old Mrs. Yarnell, who had known every family in Larkspur Hollow for 40 years, was heard to remark to her husband on the walk home, "That Calloway girl always did have more sense than the rest of this town put together. Took a smart man to see it before the rest of us caught up, and I'll admit I'm glad he did." 5 years later, the sign over the ranch kitchen door read, "Cartwright and Calloway," a compromise Jonah had insisted on over Josephine's protests that a cook's name had no business on a rancher's gatepost. "Every man in this county eats because of what happens in that kitchen," he'd told her, hanging the sign himself on a Sunday afternoon while their eldest toddled around his boots. "Name belongs there, same as mine belongs on the deed, and I won't hear another word on it." The ranch had grown, and so had the household. 2 children now, a boy who followed his father into the corrals with a seriousness well beyond his years, and a girl who was already, at 3, more interested in her mother's stove than any toy in the house, standing on a stool to watch the bread rise with the same patient attention Josephine gave it herself. Josephine still rose at 4 in the morning, though these days it was out of habit rather than necessity, with 2 hired girls now sharing the kitchen's heaviest work, and Jonah still came in for coffee at 1:30, though the ritual had long since stopped being a secret from anyone in 3 counties. It was on an ordinary morning in early autumn that a girl named Ruthie Vance showed up at the kitchen door, 17 years old, and recently let go from her position at the Larkspur Hollow boarding house for not being suited to the front room, as her previous employer had put it, a polite way of saying Ruthie was plain, thick around the middle, and walked with the particular stoop of a girl who had spent years trying to take up less space than she occupied. Her shoulders curled inward, as though bracing for a remark that hadn't come yet. "I heard you might need kitchen help," Ruthie said, not quite meeting Josephine's eyes, twisting the strap of a worn carpet bag in both hands. "I know I'm not much to look at for company, but I can cook. My mother taught me before she passed, and I've kept it up on my own since." Josephine studied her for a long moment, the stoop, the downcast eyes, the careful way Ruthie held her shoulders in, as if bracing for a comment that hadn't come yet, exactly the way Josephine herself once had, 5 years and a lifetime ago. "Straighten up, girl," Josephine said, not unkindly, setting down the dough she'd been working. "You're not applying to be looked at. You're applying to feed a working ranch, and from where I'm standing, that's a job for someone with strong arms and no patience for nonsense. Show me your hands." Ruthie held them out, uncertain, and Josephine turned them over once, noting the calluses at the base of each finger, the burn scar along one wrist from an oven rack, the sure grip when Josephine pressed a thumb briefly against her palm to test it. "These are working hands," Josephine said. "You'll do fine here. We start at 4. You'll learn the starter first. It's temperamental. and it doesn't care whether you're nervous, so you'd best not be, not around it." Ruthie's shoulders came up, slowly, like she wasn't quite sure the permission was real, and something in her face shifted. The particular, quiet lightening of a person who has just been told, by someone who clearly meant it, that they are enough, exactly as they are, without qualification and without pity. "Front of the house is yours whenever you want it, too," Josephine added, handing her an apron folded fresh from the line. "Nobody in this kitchen decides what you're suited for but you. I learned that the hard way, and I don't see the sense in you learning it any slower than you have to." Josephine watched her go to work at the stove that first morning, sleeves rolled, moving with the careful uncertainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to trust her own hands the way Josephine trusted hers. She would learn. Josephine intended to see to it personally, the way someone once, without ever quite saying so out loud, had seen to it for her. No one had ever had to notice Josephine Calloway for her to know her own worth. She had simply decided it herself, one 4 o'clock morning at a time, long before anyone else in Larkspur Hollow thought to catch up. And now, watching a girl who reminded her so plainly of herself find her footing in the very kitchen where it had all begun, Josephine understood, finally, what the whole of it had been for.